Welcome to Grief Sucks Life After Loss, where we talk all things grief. Thanks for being with us today, and we hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome, Jason. Thanks for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, you have quite the story to tell.
I've had a few trials and tribulations in my life, I would say.
Unfortunately, sometimes I feel like we go through those to create a different path to help others.
Sure, certainly.
And I think that you are doing an amazing job doing that.
Well, thank you.
So, would you like to share some of your story with us and kind of what you're doing as a result of that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm a married father of two special needs kids. Both of those kids were born with several cognitive and physical disabilities. My son was also born with a rare condition that's 1 in 40,000 births at this point. At this point, my son was our first child, and so he was kind of our introduction into the special needs world, special needs life, if you will. And then after we had our son and we found out about all of his issues and we were learning about new issues that were popping up, my wife and I, we always wanted to have more than one child. So you can imagine the kind of the family response when we said, even though we have this one child with a ton of medical issues, we're going to have another one. And, the reason why we had another one outside of just wanting another one, I had done a ton of research. And so nothing told me that just because my son had all these issues meant anything that my daughter was going to have any issues. At least for the first 6 months, she was what we would call the normal child, just because based on my son's developmental ability, she looked normal. But after we got her tested and seen some doctors, those doctors said, well, we tend to agree that she might be delayed. You might want to start seeing a neurologist. And they listed a couple of different doctors. And it was from that point that we found out our daughter had several disabilities. And so within about the first 3 years of marriage, we had two kids, both with multiple disabilities, some of which were rare.
As if marriage isn't hard enough.
Yeah. And now, granted, we got married. I say we got married. We got married later in the sense of later than the norm, not so much late. Like, we got married. I was in kind of my mid to late 20s. My wife was in her early 30s when we got married. So we were a little bit later. And we knew that once we got married, at least for my wife, I knew the clock was ticking. And we knew that we wanted to have kids. And like she jokingly gave me an ultimatum. I want to have X number of kids by this age. And I went, okay, let's rock and roll. So, but that's kind of the backstory. So my profession by degree is education. I taught elementary school physical education for 9 years. My son was born about my 7th year in education. I did have somebody that we knew well watch him, even with all of his medical issues. And so I taught 2 more years. And that last year I was in the school system, the first 6 months of that year, I was in and out of the hospital so much that I'd literally burned through all my sick time, my personal time. I was having days without pay because we were in and out of the hospital. And so about January of that year, I was teaching at a local elementary school. And one day I just called my wife from my office and said, hey, what are your thoughts about me staying at home? Because it was always kind of decided that I was going to stay at home anyways. Because even with me working, I did all the physical medical procedures. And so it was kind of, we always knew that whenever that day came, I was going to be the one to kind of leave the career and take care of the kids. And so, we had the typical talk. She said, well, if we're waiting until we're prepared, we'll never be prepared. And so that was a Wednesday of that week. By Friday, my resignation was on my principal's desk, and I was driving out that afternoon, leaving education, and I left. I left for 12 years. In fact, my principal, when I went into the office, I said, are you surprised? She said, no, I'm not really surprised, but I'm kind of surprised at the speed in which you did it. And I said, I'm just one of those people that when I make a decision, I don't kind of dilly-dally around. I make the decision and I move on. And so that's kind of how it started, to where I was, a stay-at-home parent and dealing with all the medical issues. And I did all the physical medical procedures. I did all the specialist stays. I did all the hospital stays. I did all the, school IEP meetings and everything associated with both of my kids. So that's kind of the backstory. 2 years ago, in January 28th of 2022, about 3 days before. Now, granted, at this point, I'm pretty well versed in all of his medical issues that I'm familiar with. And I know all the signs and the symptoms and what to do and how to do and what to look for and all that kind of thing. Well, 3 days before my son passed, he came home, we fed him, he ate like a horse. And that night he threw up a little bit when we were brushing his teeth, and we didn't think much about it. And I told my wife, I said, well, maybe you hit his gag reflex and something was kind of in his system. It just came up. So we put him to bed, and he was always a really good sleeper. And that night he was up and down all night, which was unusual for him. And I told my wife the next morning, I said, I'm going to keep him home. I'm going to let his teacher know. I said, he might be coming down with what we think is a 24-hour virus. But he was in a self-contained classroom. So if he was contagious, I didn't want to send him to school and have him spread it, and then him just get to school, and then an hour later we have to go get him.
Yeah.
So I just kept him home. And so that day, I kept telling him, I was just like, buddy, you can take a nap. You're not missing anything. Dave's just going to be on the couch on his laptop getting some work done. It's okay. You're not missing anything. And he absolutely refused to take a nap all day long. And so that evening I put him down when I put his sister down, which I would put his sister down and keep him up about another hour just to give some one-on-one time. And so that night I put him down for the same time as his sister, and he immediately got quiet. And my wife and I just said, well, he's probably exhausted. He's been up for probably 20 something hours. He's probably, it got dark in there. He fell asleep. So the next morning I decided to keep him home. It's a Friday at this point. And I texted the teacher again and said, hey, I'm going to keep him home again one more day. I said, if he's not feeling well, I said, at least I've got the weekend at this point to kind of help him get better, and he'll be back on Monday. And she was great with it. I got his sister off to school. And usually what would happen is when I'd go into their bedroom on the weekends, they would both get really excited. Like they'd bounce in their bed and be happy to see me. And, they'd kind of go nutty, if you will, when I'd walk in their room. And so I walk in there, and he's just kind of looking at me. He's not really excited. I wouldn't say he's lethargic, but he's not moving a whole lot. And so I walk around to his right side, and he's got this dark green streak of fluid coming out of his mouth. And I look at him, and in my brain I go, well, the only thing dark green in your body that would possibly come out is bile. And why is it coming out of his mouth? And I looked at my wife and I said, this is not good. And I get him out of the bed. And he's kind of floppy, like he can't hold himself up. And even this doesn't strike me, just because there were a couple of times when he had really bad, respiratory related illnesses where he got eventually admitted. I thought, well, maybe he's coming down with something and I need to take him to the hospital. So I bring him into the living room, and I'd go through my protocol of what I need to do, and nothing's working. The signs I'm seeing are nothing that I've ever seen before. And it was honestly just a hunch. I went, I'm going to take him up to the children's hospital. I said, something's not right. And I said, I don't know what it is. So I get him in his chair and get him into our van, and I'm on the southwest side of Atlanta. The children's hospital is 60 miles north of me.
Oh, goodness.
And it sounds like a lot, but in Atlanta, 60 miles is not. I mean, Atlanta, in quotation marks, probably spans 125 to 150 miles across. And that's just east to west. That's not north and south. And so I'd been driving this so many times from hospital stays and all that I could do it blindfolded. I've done it so many times. And so I get on the interstate, and I'm doing 90 up the interstate because I don't know what's going on. And the whole way up, he looks like at the time I didn't realize it, but he looked like he was kind of falling asleep and waking back up. And I kept trying to keep him up because when you get a concussion, you don't want to fall asleep right afterwards because it could create other damage by falling asleep. And I kept going, buddy, stay with me. And the whole way up, he kept doing that. And I got up to the children's hospital. I got parked. I got him out of the van to get him in his wheelchair again. He was really floppy, and this catches my attention, and I go, something's really not right. I get up into the ER and I skip the line. And before I can get up to the nurse, like the security guard comes up to me as if to say, you need to get in line. And I look right at him and go, I don't think he's breathing. I need help immediately. And so the nurse hears me. She gets me. She says, follow me. Now, I've been in this hospital 100 times, and this is the first time I ever go to full run as fast as I can go back to an ER trauma room, because that's how serious this nurse is looking to me.
Right.
So I get him in the trauma room. I instinctively get him out of his chair. I put him on the table and I back off in hopes that they'll let me stay in there, because he's nonverbal. And I'm just like, they don't know what's going on, and he can't tell them. And so there's another trauma room right next to it that I kind of back off in, and I let them do their thing. And so the ER doc comes up to me and goes, explain to me to the minute how long he's been this way. And I tell her, and she goes off and barks orders. And then she comes back over to me and goes, explain to me the scenario as to why you brought him up here. And so I tell her, and they keep doing their thing. So I get him in there. They immediately intubate him, like put the tube in him to get air in his lungs. And the first thing that they do that tells me something seriously wrong is they take this drill and like drill this port directly into his knee. No anesthetic, nothing.
Oh, shit.
Now a normal person would probably come out of their skin because of how painful that would be. He didn't even flinch. And so after about 10 minutes, they start chest compressions. They start doing CPR. And as I'm watching this in my brain, I'm thinking things are getting more serious, but it's not registering to me of how serious it is. So they do that for about 5 or 10 minutes, and they're switching off doing it. And I hear them get the paddles out. And so they put the paddles on, and I hear, like on medical dramas, you hear clear, and literally he lifts off the table, like what you see on TV. And I'm so used to looking at the monitor with like the oxygen rate and the pulse and the respiratory rates, and they shock them, and it literally beeps once and goes right back to what it's doing. And in my brain at this point, I go, he's not coming back. Now, it doesn't register in my brain, but I go, he's not coming back. From this point, they continue doing this work on him for 45 continuous minutes. It was the longest amount of time. And I told them later, I said, medical dramas don't do y'all justice. I said, I knew y'all do what you could to try to bring him back, but they worked for almost an hour trying to bring him back. And so they shock him probably 4 or 5 more times. And she eventually comes over to me and says, she pronounces him. And I go over and have a moment instinctually, and I come back over, and from that point, like I call his mother and call my mother, and I'll never forget the sounds they made over the phone, because my wife at the time thought, well, he's taking him up there, he's going to get admitted, we're going to have our typical 7 to 12 day stay. He'll let me know what room he's in when I call. She didn't realize I was calling to tell him that her son was dead on the table. And so, we kind of went from there, and that's kind of where the whole ball started, and kind of the introduction to the whole grief experience is.
Sorry, not too many people can get to me. You got to me.
Well, and I know.
I feel, and I don't speak about it a lot, but I feel that ER experience. And being the only one in that experience. And I thank God that I was the only one in that. Because my kids were meeting me thinking, we're just going to go in and see what's wrong with dad. And that's not what they walked into. And I remember feeling that, standing there, like almost as soon as I knew that something was really wrong, that I just knew he wasn't coming back. And even while they were working on him, I'm just like, it's for nothing. I just felt it deep in my heart that it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, and definitely later on down the road, my mother told me, because my mother was the second call, just because she watched my son many times when he was younger, to like give us a break, and just because the special needs life for just general issues is tough, but when you've got rare conditions and multiple issues, it can be very demanding.
Mhm.
And like my mother told me after everything was said and done and we had the funeral, that kind of thing, she goes, the day that you called me when he passed away, she said, it had probably only been a few minutes after he passed, correct? And I said, yes, like 2. And she said, you were eerily calm, like nothing had happened. Like she said, you could hear the calmness in your voice when you talked to me. Whereas I thought you'd have just been like blubbering. And I mean, she didn't say it that way, but
It's weird. It's weird how that, I guess, how you don't maybe have the reaction that you even think that you're going to have to that. You're just so, I don't know, numb, or just don't understand. You're not grasping what really just happened.
well, and from a male perspective, men are taught from a very early age, at least early, like teens, 20s, that kind of thing. We learn to compartmentalize things very quickly. And in that moment, even though I wanted to lose, in that moment, I wanted to lose my shit.
Mm-hmm.
But my thought process was, I've got to keep it together to tell his mother, my mother. I've got to ask about 50 questions here. In fact, when the care team, like we were still in the room and the ER doc was just like, we don't need this room anytime soon. She said, no, you can't necessarily be here all day, but take your time. She said, there's be plenty of time for his mother to come up, because she was coming up from where we were and that kind of thing. And so the care team came up to me and I looked right at her and I pointed at my son and I said, this is going to sound cold and callous and I don't mean it to be, but I pointed to him and I said, I will deal with him in a minute. I need to know some answers and I need to know them now. And she goes, well, what do you need to know? And she literally took a step back, because I went, what happens from here? Does he go to the morgue? Does he stay in here? If he goes to the morgue, at that point, do you do an autopsy? If you do, what's the protocol for doing an autopsy? If you don't do an autopsy, why aren't you doing an autopsy? And what's the protocol for that? If you do an autopsy, what's the turnaround time for it? If you don't do an autopsy, who do I need to contact to get him home to the funeral home that I need to get him to? And I fired off, and she stepped back and she just had this look of almost, you just asked me like 9 questions, all rapid fire. And I said, look, information will make me feel better at this point.
Yeah.
And so she was just kind of like, well, I'm going to go talk to the coroner, see what his decision is. And so she comes back 5 minutes later and she said, well, the coroner has decided that he's not going to do an autopsy. And I wasn't trying to be mean to her, but I literally looked at her and went, why? Why is he not going to do an autopsy? I said, I want to know the protocol as to why he would or would not do an autopsy. I said, because he was perfectly fine before. I said, he woke up at 9 o'clock this morning. I said, it is 10:45. He's dead on a table. You can't tell me that's normal. And so she comes back, and I mean, she was great. I gave her all the credit in the world. She said, well, typically in a children's hospital, the reason why they would do an autopsy is, one, if they were perfectly healthy and they came in and they died, if it's drug related, abuse related, or court related. And she said, the reason why he's not going to do an autopsy on your son is because he has an extensive history of medical issues, several of which could have caused the situation that brought him here. And I said, okay, I am okay with that response. And it was more like I wanted to know what their thinking was, not so much as I was wanting to jump down her throat. It was, well, what's the thought process here? Because even though he's got medical needs, it still was a total of maybe 3 hours since he was awake this morning until he passed away.
Right.
And so she was great. And, after the fact, everybody asked me, they said, well, can you, outside of losing your son, was there anything that was really difficult? And I said, probably the most difficult thing I ever had to do was, my wife had come up with her family and we spent about an hour, and then we decided that we were going to drive home. And I had to take all of his cut off clothes, put it on his empty wheelchair, and wheel that wheelchair through the hospital to the thing, put it in his van, and drive 60 miles home in dead silence. It was my wife and I talked a little bit on the way home, but it was more, we were just stunned, like what just happened. And so like you can see Zach written on the wall behind me. This is his room. And like where it says Zach on the wall back there is his wheelchair. That's where I left it there almost 3 years ago. I have not moved it since. Like I came into this room, I put his chair in here, and like the weight of the world, just like a Mack truck hit me. I just lost it at that point. And so I regained my composure. And at that point, we went over to my parents' house, and like my whole family was there. And I walked in the door, and my brothers and I, we have a relationship in the sense that we're friendly to each other. We love each other, but do we talk all the time? Not so much. And so I walked in and I saw my eldest brother, and something about see him. And I literally, I almost buckled. I mean, I lost it. I don't know what it was about seeing him. And, you know, I just uncontrollably, and I went into my parents' room and I tried to regain composure, and everybody was sitting there. And I mean, they understandably wanted to know. And so I was trying to tell them, but, you know, I'd get 5 or 6 words out and I'd get that kind of trembling, well, you know, you're about to lose it kind of feeling in your throat. And it took me forever to get through it. And so I finally got through it. And at that point, it was about noon. And so we went, I think we went to the funeral home that day. Good, bad, or indifferent. No, it was the next day. So we went to the funeral home the next day. And like everybody tells you, the worst day of your life happens and you have to make 1,000 decisions. And so we went in there, and the place we used was phenomenal. You know, you hear these horror stories, but the place that we used was phenomenal. They never pressured us. They never said, you have to do this. They just said, here's how we do package deals. You can add or take away from them, or you can do kind of a la carte, that kind of thing. And again, I give them all the credit in the world. They were great. So we get in there, they tell us everything. And I said, well, can we take this information home? I said, can we make an appointment for the next day? And I said, we'll make a decision tomorrow. And he was great about it. And so we get in there the next day, and he said, well, the first question I've got to ask you, are you going to bury or are you going to cremate? And we were originally going to do originally going to bury, but when he told us kind of what the cost was for him and the fact that the graveyard and the headstone, that was all separate. And I said, and I asked him, I said, well, what's kind of the ballpark for that in? And when he told me on top of what we were going to spend there, I looked at my wife and I went, And then we got to talking about it, and I looked at my wife and I said, we have to understand, if we bury him here, if we ever move, he's here. So at least if we cremate him, we have an urn, we can take him with us, per se. And so it was at that point, outside of the fact that it wasn't much cheaper, but it was the cheaper of the options on that kind of end of life stuff. And so we decided that we were going to cremate. Although the one side story of it all, and I have a twisted sense of humor when I'm dealing with a lot of emotion, I have a twisted sense of humor.
I do too.
We decide that we're going to cremate, and the funeral director comes over to us and goes, I'm required by federal law. And I go, stop. I said, what does the U.S. government want to know anything about why I'm cremating my son? And he looks at me and he goes, I'm required by federal law to tell you that the state or form in which your loved one enters the crematorium is not the same state that they will come out of the crematorium. He said, I want to make sure that you are fully aware that your loved one cannot go back to his or her original state once they have entered the crematorium. And literally, I dead stop in there. I look up from this piece of paper and I go, who the fuck thinks that they're going to go back? Right. And he just looks at me and I said, it's fire. Do they not know what fire does? He doesn't skip a beat and he doesn't say anything, but he gives me this look of like, you would be amazed at how many people get upset not realizing that.
Oh my goodness.
So he gives me this. We literally have to initial in 8 spots on front and back of this page saying that we are fully aware. And I went, I literally looked at him and went, I know I might be lucid right now because of just my state of mind. I said, but this baffles my mind that people think that you throw a log into a fire and when it's done, it's ash. It's the same concept.
Things happening.
He just kind of smirks at me, and I know why he didn't say anything, but I almost wanted to go, when we get out of here, can you tell me the real story? Because I really want to know,
Right.
kind of thing. So, but, we went through that process, and, that was really difficult. And the viewing, and I will say in a weird way, one of the happy moments that I had is when we had the viewing. I was shocked at how many people actually came out. I did not think we were going to have that many people go to the viewing because, it was a lot of his teachers, a lot of his parapros. He'd been to several different schools, his special needs. So it just, in a good way, it shocked me how many people actually were there. And then, the day of like the service and all, and all, at least over here where we were at, the family, the family that had actually lost a loved one, they were on the left side of like the aisle. And the reason why I comment on that was I came across a quote or something, and it might have been a saying that said, "You'll never understand grief until you're that family sitting on the left side." And so that always stuck with me, and I went, "You're right." Especially with we did 2 songs. Oh Lord, what was the song? My wife did the one. There's a popular one by Rascal Flatts, "My Wish."
Mm-hmm.
She did with him, and then I've always been a fan of Amazing Grace, and Pentatonics came out with one that just floored me that I loved so much, and when that started playing, I couldn't contain it. I was just but so that was February of 2022. And to get into kind of what I'm doing now, I've always been a big proponent of therapy. I'm sure not many men say that, but I have always been. I believe that we go through seasons of just needing some mental help assistance. And honestly, about 2 weeks before he actually passed, I literally called my counselor and said, "Hey, I think I've kind of run through a season. I don't think I've got enough to talk about for an hour." I said, "You've helped me through, what I initially came to see you for." I said, "I'll keep you on speed dial should I need you, and I'll get on your waiting list," kind of thing. She'd go, "Okay." And then when everything happened, I called her up and I said, "Hey, I need an emergency session." I said, "You will understand when we talk." I said, "It's not something I want to talk about over the phone." And so we get in there, and at this point, I'm going once a week just because of everything going on. And about my 5th or 6th week going, she goes, "Have you ever thought about journaling your feelings?" And it wasn't that I didn't want to. It was just I didn't think I was that great of a writer at that point, which now that I look back, there's a lot of irony in the statement that I made. And I literally looked at her and when I said, "I don't know if that's my thing." And she goes, "Well, you don't have to do it right now." She goes, "Put it on the back burner or on the side table, so to speak." She said, "The reason why I'm asking you to do it is it's more of a mindfulness activity. It's so you can get your feelings out." She said, "You don't have to share it with anybody." She said, "If you write it out, you can burn it. You can shred it. You can do whatever you want. You don't have to share it." And I said, "Okay." And so that literally kind of proverbially sat on my side table for 8 or 9 months after the fact. And then one day I'm watching a Facebook reel, and something in one of the reels, it was either a medical scene or something that my son liked. I forget what it was. I watched it and man, it gut punched me. And I just start bawling at this point. And it was at that point I opened a Word document and in proper Oxford English style letter form, I write a letter as if I'm writing a letter to my son to the house. And I just verbally vomit on a page, like to the point that if I feel like I need to write an F-bomb because that's the emotion that I'm feeling, that's what I'm writing. And I do this a couple of times a day for weeks at this point, just to get the feelings out. And I'm saving them on my computer. And for some reason, I saved them. To this day, I don't remember. I don't know why I ever saved them. I think I was originally just going to delete them, but I kept them for some reason. And so I do this for several weeks, and I get on Facebook and I search for a group, because we know there's a group for everything on Facebook.
And there is a ton for grief.
Yep. And so I actually find a group called Parents Who Lost a Special Needs Child, which I was shocked to find, because that's such a finite niche part of grief. Mm-hmm. I just ran across it, and I got to know the admin, a woman, very well. In fact, I admin the group for a while. And I said, one day, do you mind if I post one of my journal entries? And her immediate response was, yes, we get no man ever deciding that they want to share their feelings. We would love for you to have it. And I said, okay. So, I've got weeks to go through, and I pick one that's this kind of raw. And right before I post it, I go, in my head, I'm thinking, I said, well, even though this is a noble idea and I may get a lot of positive, I have to mentally prepare myself for the fact I might get negative. And am I in a mental space that I can handle it? Mm-hmm. I said, because I don't want someone to say something negative for whatever reason and me to just fly off a handle, because, this is personal to me. Mm-hmm. And, in my fashion, I think about it for literally 2 minutes and I just went, screw it. I'm just going to post it anyway. The hell with what they think. It's how I feel. It doesn't matter what they think. And so I copy and paste it in the group, and I literally put a disclaimer, and I said, I write in a very raw, transparent way. If you are close to the loss of your loved one and this is going to trigger you, scroll on. I said, because I am not sugarcoating this. I will not sugarcoat this. I said, I believe that the world needs to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of grief in real time, not what we see on TV. And so I said, so if this is going to bother you, scroll on. I am warning you now. And I think I said something to the effect, if you come at me because you don't like what I stated, I said, the full force of my grief is going to come back at you. And I said, let me tell you, I said, I will not hold. I said, when you read this letter, you'll know that I will not hold back. Oh. So I do that, and I wait, and it takes a while. And then the comments just start coming in. I get these massively positive responses. A lot of the mothers and the girlfriends and the wives and you name it are all making these just great comments. I had one woman, she goes, you just joined this group. We've never talked. We've never met. We've never had a conversation. She said, I've never told anybody how I feel deep down. And she goes, your letter right now hits word for word how I feel. And I said, well, I really appreciate that I can write something that resonates with you. I said, this is inspiration from my son and just what people would call bluntness, if you will. And I said, I appreciate, that you can take something away from this. And so I keep writing letters in there. And every time I do it, I'm getting the same response. And after about 5 or 6 weeks, finally about the 5th or 6th week, I go, I think I might have something here. Mm-hmm. And probably for you, before doing your podcast, you probably had people go, well, have you ever thought about writing a book? Have you thought about doing a podcast? Have you thought? And so I'm getting all these comments, and I said, well, I appreciate the comments, but in the moment that they were saying that, I said, I don't know if I'm in the right headspace to do that at this point. I said, I might somewhere down the road. I said, but right now, that's just a lot for me to handle right now. And so finally someone comes and goes, well, have you ever thought about doing a Facebook page? And I said, well, what do you mean by that? I said, you can make a page like, let's say your favorite, restaurant has a page. And she said, you don't have to create any more content. You basically just can copy and paste if you don't want to create newer content than what you're already doing. And I said, well, I could do that. And so I started doing that. And like everybody, I got my tip. I had 10 or 20 followers, family, friends, that kind of thing. And one day I got this wild hair and I started reaching out to all what I would consider the big names in the grief community. And I just said, hey, my name is so-and-so. I've got a page on here. I think I have something here. And I'd just like to know, some pointers, like what direction it worked out for you, what direction did you try, and it wasn't that great. And literally everybody that I contacted was phenomenal. They were just like, well, if you're going to write a book, you're going to want to create a website at some point. You're going to want to do A, B, and C. If you're going to do a podcast, you're probably still going to want to do a website, but you're going to also want to do D, E, and F. And so I employed all those kind of points. And when I did that, I started getting like 20 and 30 followers a day. I mean,
Sorry.
I hear I'm getting background music.
I know my son's trying to get him. Normally he's quiet, but every now and then he lets it go.
That's fine. And so, long story short, this month marks a year that I've been doing it. I'm right at about 1,200 followers. I've got followers that come to the page in 26 countries and just about every U.S. state.
Wow.
And I only say that just because if someone would have told me a year ago that, I would have that and I'd be doing podcasts and talking to you, I'd have looked at them and said, you're crazy. You're out of your mind. And
I get that.
So I decided to do Letters to Zachary, which is the page on Facebook and my website, because I wanted to be, instead of complaining about it, I wanted to be an example. Mm-hmm. And, I tell people all the time, I said, I'm not perfect at it. I make mistakes all the time. In fact, in the first couple of months, there were some statements I made on my page that made me put my foot in my mouth that I lost followers over. And, you live and you learn, that kind of thing. But I wanted to be an example, no matter how good or bad I was at it. And that is, like I've told my wife several times, I said, I really think the selling point of Letters to Zachary, outside of it being grief and a man, because apparently I'm a unicorn doing it from what people tell me, is the fact that I don't hold back. I don't sugarcoat it. I'm very transparent. When I'm having an effed up day, I will say I'm having an effed up day, that kind of thing. And I think people resonate with that.
They do. And I think it's important, regardless of how we're sharing, to be our true self, because the people that are like us resonate to that. And sometimes, people share and put it to a more professional level. Uh-huh. And it's harder for people to resonate sometimes with, I guess, that way of doing things.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I'm on my page, for those that may want to go to it. I've got in letter form, I've got in prose and poetry style, I've got meme form. And I've even got I will, on Facebook, you can share something on your page, but right above it. Uh-huh. And I'll share something from someone else's page, and I'm really ADD about giving them credit for their original work. So I'll give them credit for their work, and then I will come back and write my commentary of what they've written, just from the male perspective. Okay. On there is typically what I'll do, and it's not to bash what they're doing. It's just to show it from a kind of a different lens. Is how I do it. So that's a lot of what my page is on there. The other reason why I do it is because one of the pretty consistent comments I get in this entire year I've been doing this has been, we lost our child, or, we lost our child, X number of months or maybe a year ago, and my husband's not opening up. What do I need to do? And I'll go, well, I have some things that I can tell you that I know would work with me. Will it work with your husband? It's possible. I said, but I'm not going to say yes, it's going to work 100% of the time. If you married an old crusty Marine veteran that may not want to open up, what I'm telling you may or may not work. That's been to war. Yeah. This may not work. And so I did that because I originally did the page for men, and then I opened it up to anybody that had lost a loved one. And then I finally, it's going to sound weird to say this, but I then opened it up to women. And what I mean by that is to say, for those women that don't have an kind of an idea of how a man grieves, at least I can give them some perspective, and they can take that back to whoever their significant other is and maybe use it to help with whatever their situation is. And so, like I say, I try to help empower them to understand kind of where the male mind is coming from, so
And
that when they're talking with their husbands or their siblings that are men, they've got kind of an idea of kind of how to direct the conversation.
I love that because I have a lot of men in my life
Mm-hmm.
that were particularly affected from my husband's death, but
Mm-hmm.
they don't open up about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that 3 years later, they're still hurting badly.
Yeah.
And their significant others don't know how to approach that or how to help that situation.
Well, and I even came up with what I call the male grief constitution, which is kind of 10 points that I've kind of thought out through my head of things that I think would work with me
Okay.
to help women understand kind of the male point of view. Some of the things that women have to understand is just it's not good or bad, it's just different. There are things that men have to deal with societally that women don't necessarily have to deal with. For example, women are brought up to be more emotional. It's okay to be emotional, it's okay to open up. That kind of stereotype, if you will. Men are taught, well, I'm 48, so I'm Generation X. I was taught, the whole tape it up and walk it off, rub some dirt on it kind of generation. And even though it kind of slowly started with my generation, it's gotten much better now. I learned all my life that, even like one of the times when I played football in high school, I had a coach that always come up and go, "Are you hurt or are you injured?" Because there's a difference. And so that's kind of the mentality a lot of men live with when it comes to just life. And so men are taught, we're the providers or the protectors of the family. We're here to make sure the family is safe and provided with, even if that comes with emotion. I'm not saying that as a negative. 99.9% of men would have it that way. They would, if it means to almost the detriment of me, I would rather my wife, my son, my daughter be happy and successful and all that, even if it's on my back trying to do it. I mean, a lot of men, they like that, they thrive in that. But on the other end, you kind of get what we're getting, where a lot of men are closed-minded when it comes to emotion and don't want to open up. The other two things, I won't go through all of them, but the other two things I typically will tell women, and I say this, and I've gotten backlash from a lot of women online when I say this, and I say it's not personal. I'm not attacking women, but what I try to tell women is you have to listen and not listen to respond. And I said, if you expect a man to listen to your entire thought and then respond when you're upset about something in a relationship or something in a different area, then we expect the same. And as someone who's been married 21 years and we've had our arguments like any marriage has had, if my wife were to say something and I would interrupt her and never let her finish, I would never hear the end of it. And I've had times where I've done that and I didn't hear the end of it. And so what I tell women is, what you expect, you should give. I said, it's not a personal thing. I'm not attacking you. But if you want your man to open up, you have to be willing to listen for them to get their thought out. Because if you don't, what in a man's mind, they're gonna give you a couple of tries, and then after, like the baseball analogy, 3 strikes and you're out. Not maybe more or less than that. Once they get to that point where it's that cutoff line, they're going to go, well, why am I going to try to do when you're always interrupting? Or a lot of sentiment from men is they will say how they're feeling, and then the female significant other will take what they're feeling, turn it around as they're feeling, and throw it back at them, is what they'll do. And I will say, it's happened to me. I will say I've heard it from other men. That is very irritating. Just because I'm having a moment of frustration or emotion doesn't mean it's attacking you. It doesn't mean anything else other than the fact that this is what my emotion is. And if you don't let me get it out to say it, then it's going to get to a point where I'm just going to go, well, she doesn't want to hear it. I'm just not going to say it. I'll compartmentalize it. I will move on. The last thing that I will say for the other side per se is men have learned very quickly and throughout their dating life and all that is, why am I going to say something if it's going to get thrown back at me? Or if I open up and I'm vulnerable, I know that at some point there's a possibility when we get into an argument, it's going to get thrown back in my face. And I'd rather not deal with that. And so those are probably the three biggest thing I try to tell women. Now, I'm polite, and I'm polite when I say it to them about it, but I say those are the three big ones. I said, because men are all about respect and trust. Those are the two big ones. I said, you can't have one without the other. And I said, if you break one, then it's hard getting the other. And men are very simple creatures. I admit it, been one all my life. And so it doesn't take a whole lot to make us happy. And I just, I try to say that and just say, look, all I'm telling you is listen, let him get it out. If he brings it to you and it's serious enough to him, let him get it out. I said, if you blow it off or roll your eyes or think or even say, really, you're having an issue, that's your problem, he's going to take that as a strike. And eventually, if you say it enough, you're not going to hear from him again. So is what I try to tell people.
Very good advice, and very helpful as well, because I think as a woman, sometimes we don't think about things like that, but it is harder for men to speak on their feelings, and especially when it comes to a death or grieving anything, really. So when that does come to us, we need to think about how we're going to react and how we're going to perceive that, so that we do it cautiously, so that it's a safe space for everybody.
Certainly. And then to kind of circle back for one thing, when it comes to society and all that, we're taught to compartmentalize. We're taught to kind of bury feelings, and we're there to get whatever the job is done. We're there to, whatever you consider macho and manly to get done. That's what we're kind of taught to do. But what we're also taught is the woman's feelings come first, almost at all expense. And what I mean by that is, or the example I give is, when I've said it online, I've literally had women go, no, it's not that way. And I go, really? I said, on the street I live, there's probably 50 houses. I said, I bet I can go into any one of those houses. I can go into their kitchen or their bathroom maybe. And I said, I guarantee you at least one of those houses, you'll walk in there and there'll be a placard on there that says, happy wife, happy life. And I said, 99.9% want happy wife. There's nothing wrong with that. But what that subconsciously says is, if you're not happy, nobody's happy. And if there's any room left there might be just a little bit of room for us to say what we feel, that kind of thing. And then that's when you got to start factoring everything else I was saying into kind of the equation. And so, again, I don't say that as a bad thing. Almost 100% of men want that. That's kind of what we're geared to do. But you have to understand it kind of from that context.
Do you made a coloring book?
I did. So the goal of Letters to Zachary, outside of sharing my emotions and being an example, was I always wanted to create a legacy for my son. And I didn't know how I was going to do that. At one point, I was just like, I want to make something, like, I'm very tactile in learning. I'm very hands-on. And I knew I always wanted something that I could hold in my hands. And so earlier this year, I came across a publisher in one of the podcasting groups, and we got to talking. And, I said, at that point, I was almost about 1,000 followers. I said, look, I've got X number of followers. I want to do something like I can hold in my hands. And I knew it wasn't going to be an actual book, just because I knew the expense that was going into like writing a book. And I told her, I said, look, at this point, I don't have the funds to start writing a book because it can get into the thousands of dollars to write a book. And so we got to brainstorming, and she goes, well, have you ever thought about a coloring book? She said the expense would be much less, and then you could market it to probably a more vast audience. And I thought, well, that's unusual. And, I've always been kind of a little right of normal anyways. And so I said, yeah, let's run with that. And so the simplistic way I can explain it is through the publisher's website, we created kind of a mock website for me. We put a survey on there, and all the people I'd conversed with in the grief community, I said, hey, if you would like to be a part of a grief coloring book, go to this website, fill out the survey. And so basically what that survey asked was who your loved one was, kind of when they passed, where you're from. And then it asked them to write attributes that were positive about their loved one. Favorite things, favorite sayings, maybe a favorite sentence or two, just things about them. And then when that got sent off, it would go to the publishers and the illustrators. And what they would do is they would compile all of their information and make a full page coloring book page based on the information that they submitted. So like I told them, I said, let's say you want to emphasize a specific thing. I said, when you're writing in that survey, make note that you want to emphasize this. I said, because these illustrators don't know who you are.
Yeah.
So if you want something centralized in there, you need to let them know. And so after many months of work, we have Letters to Zachary, the coloring book right there. And let me see if I can find one real quick. Like, for example, this is one of the person's pages. And then on the other side was kind of writing about them. As you can see, they listed who they were, where they're from, that kind of thing. And it just listed some positive attributes about them.
That is awesome.
And so I did that because, like, this didn't cost anything for them. I just wanted their input. And I said, look, the only cost for you is going to be if you get selected to be in there, which just about everybody did. I said, it will cost you whatever it is to buy the book. I said, the coloring book's $14.99. I said, it's not, in today's standards, it's not that expensive.
Yeah.
And I said, what this coloring book does is it's basically a memorial. It's an active and interactive memorial that will literally outlast all of us. And I said, not only will it be, I said, now granted, my namesake's on the book. And I said, yeah, I'll have a little more in there because I'm the one that kind of came up with the publisher to create it. But I said, this is all of our coloring book. This is something that you can hold on to, if you're having a rough moment. You can go back to this. The last reason for it is, I still have my daughter. So I thought, well, how can I explain death and grief to my daughter? Now, I'm a little different because my daughter has developmental delays. So I have to make it very simplistic for her to get it. But as I'm thinking about this, I go, well, let's say I'm a family. I've got children that don't have medical disabilities. How can I bridge the gap for like a mother or a father to talk with the remaining sibling or siblings that are there to kind of dumb down or simplify such complex topics? And so now this coloring book doesn't actually go over the topics, but what it does is, like me writing, is kind of a mindfulness activity. It's a distraction so that it gives the parent time to kind of think of ways while they're coloring to explain these topics. What it does. So yes, it's for the child, but it's more to kind of give the adult kind of a leg up while they're kind of distracted coloring. Like I would be like, well, how am I going to explain this while they're coloring, doing this? I'm brainstorming as I'm trying to figure out how to talk to them. And so that's kind of the other way that I marketed it, if you will.
Nope, I love it. And I like to color. So before we finish up, will you tell us about Zachary? What kind of boy was he? What did he like? What did he enjoy?
My son, when he passed, was 15 years old. Although with the mustache, the teenage mustache he was growing, He looked like he was 20. You know, even though he had his developmental delays, he was very much a people person. He never met a stranger. He loved his Special Olympics bowling. He loved swimming. He loved his hippotherapy, which is horseback riding therapy. He was addicted to the Weather Channel. Like I could leave the actual Weather Channel on for 18 hours a day and he'd be happy. In fact, at one point I live in Atlanta and the actual filming studios is in North Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually got a tour up there, and we met some of the on-air personalities that he had watched on TV. They just happened to be there when we were there at that moment, and so he loved that. I mean, he was very friendly, very loving, the most laid-back child you would ever meet. I mean, like one of the things I had to do for his rare condition was early on in his life, I had to give him a catheter to help him go to the bathroom. And like we had done it so much, there were times like I would lay him on the floor and he'd just put his hands behind his head and look at me like, well, let's get the show on the road, old man. And I mean, like I'd insert in the area down there. And I mean, most normal folks would go, what are you doing with that catheter and why are you going in that area? But
Yeah.
he wouldn't even flinch just because that was just what life was. So,
Yeah.
But yeah, he was very much a people person.
Well, thank you for sharing about him and your whole experience. And
Well,
I love that you are advocating for men and helping women understand the men in this situation, because I think that's very important.
Sure.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
Yes, two things. What I will say to men is it's ironic of the two genders, men do not like being told what to do, but yet when it comes to emotion, they let everybody and their brother tell them what to do. I find a whole lot of irony in that. And I go, who cares what anybody else thinks about what you're feeling, what you're dealing with? Vulnerability does not equal weakness by any stretch of the imagination, is what I would tell men out there. And then, last but not least, I would say anybody that's interested in the coloring book, you can go to letterstozachary.com. That's got all my social media where you can get to it. It's got where you can get the coloring book. It's got other media appearances and just things about my son, that kind of thing on there for those that are interested. Because I've got the Facebook page. I've got a Facebook group. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and I think I even have my LinkedIn on there.
And I'll link it all in their notes as well, so everybody has access to that.
Okay.
I appreciate you sharing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We'll talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation today. If you would like to join us on Facebook, you can find us at Grief Sucks, Life After Loss on Facebook. And if you would like to share your story with us, you can email us at griefsuckslifeafterloss@gmail.com. We look forward to seeing you again.